Hello and welcome to this first presentation in the Introduction to Linguistics seminar. Today we're going to be looking at a part of linguistics which looks at the sounds that human languages make use of. This is called phonetics. In fact, there are a whole bunch of ways that one can look at language sounds from many different perspectives. One can actually look at the physical properties of the sounds, or the way in which humans actually perceive the language sounds, which actually turns out to be different from how humans perceive any other kind of sound. But because those kinds of study of sound tend to require the use of specialized instruments, things to show things like sound waves and things like that, and we don't have access to them in this class, we're going to be looking at another aspect of phonetics, which we do have access to because we all have the appropriate equipment. This is called articulatory phonetics, and it's to do with how we actually produce language sounds. And obviously, every one of us has the relevant organs required to produce language sounds, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. Okay, let's have a very first brief look at the kinds of organs that we use in making language sounds. We can obviously make use of a lot of different sounds using our bodies in one way or another. Clapping hands and things like that are common sounds that we produce, but not all of those are used in languages. There seem to be a limited set of the kinds of sounds that one can make that is used in a language. Now, the organs that we make use of are mostly situated in the head. There are a couple of organs that are not represented on this diagram. By the way, let me introduce you to John. I told you last week that John was an important person in linguistics. Well, one of John's roles is to stand in phonetics classes and volunteer to have his head cut in half, and so that we can see the organs that are involved. Now, one of the organs that is very important for speech control isn't represented here. Let me show you it. It's the brain. The brain is a very important part of the speech production process because it's what controls everything. And actually, when you come to consider what actually goes on in producing sounds, we can see that it's actually a very intricate process that requires very minute controls of muscles and combinations of movements, and the brain is obviously responsible for all that. Now, the brain itself is specialized for dealing with language, and we know this because there are certain areas in the brain which are specifically to do with language. We can see this through the fact that if people suffer brain damage from one source or another, say some sort of stroke or an accident or something like this, it tends to, and it's in a particular area, it tends to affect our language, but it depends which area as to what aspect of language gets affected. There are two main areas that have been identified that are to do with language. One is around about here. It's called Broca's area, named after the person who discovered it. And similarly, there is another area over here, Wernicke's area, again, named after the guy who discovered it. And these two seem to be in control of different aspects of language. So if you get a damage to Broca's area, what tends to happen is that the person can understand reasonably well what had been said to them, but they have difficulty in producing fluent language. They stammer and they find it difficult to put words together to form sentences and things like that. Wernicke's area damage, however, causes something very different to happen in the patient, they have no problems in stringing words together and produce very fluent and very verbal kinds of language, but it tends not to make sense. It tends not to be the kind of thing that the person intended to say. So there are obviously different areas of the brain involved in different aspects of language. Now, we're not going to go too deeply into that, but just know that the brain is a very central aspect of coordinating all the movements involved in producing language sounds. And although we won't actually refer to it, we acknowledge its importance. The other thing which isn't represented on this part of the body that we've got here of John is his lungs. And again, the lungs play a very central part in producing sound, because sound relies on air movement. We couldn't produce any sound at all if it weren't for the fact that air flows in and out of our body. And we use that airflow specifically to make sounds in various ways. And the lungs are obviously what is responsible for getting air to flow both inwards and outwards. Now, most language sounds are made with an outflowing of air. These are known as exgressive sounds. There are some languages which make use of ingressive sounds, that is, sounds produced when the air is flowing inwards. But English and Hungarian don't have any of those, so we won't concentrate on those. So basically what we've got is the air is being forced out of the body when the lungs contract, and that flow of air is then used to produce sounds in various ways. Now, the lungs work in a very different way to produce language sounds than they do normally for their other function, that's breathing. With breathing, what we tend to do is have a more or less equal intake of breath and an outtake of breath. It's a very steady process. You breathe in, you breathe out, you breathe in, you breathe out. And that happens quite regularly, and the breathing in time and the breathing out time tends to be more or less the same. But with speech, that alters drastically, in as much as we tend to breathe in very quickly and not so often, and we breathe out when speaking quite slowly. So there's more time breathing out than there is breathing in, and that facilitates the production of sounds, as I've said. Okay, so let's have a look now at more aspects of John's vocal organs that produce sounds. Okay, first of all, note that as the air is being forced out of the lungs, it travels up through your windpipe, and then there are two ways that it can escape. One is through what we call the oral cavity, that is basically your mouth, and the other is your nasal cavity, where the air can travel out through this sort of hole in your head, more or less, and out through the nostrils. Okay, and in making language sounds, we make use of both of those to produce different sorts of sounds. Another very important organ used in making language sounds is the tongue. And your tongue is an extremely agile muscle that you can move around and form different shapes and do all sorts of things with it. And it's so agile that actually different parts of your tongue are used in making different types of sounds. There are basically three areas of the tongue which we recognize for making language sounds. There's the tip of the tongue. That's actually not so commonly used to make language sounds, but it is some of them. More commonly is the bit of the tongue just behind the tip, called the blade of the tongue, and that is used to make quite a lot of language sounds, particularly towards the front of the mouth. The third area of the tongue which is used to make language sounds is the back of the tongue, and that tends to be used to make sounds at the back of your mouth. Now, other aspects of your speech organs which are used to make sounds are the lips, And sounds which are used making the lips are often referred to as labial sounds, labia being the Latin for lips. Then we've got the teeth, and sounds which are used making use of the teeth are called dental sounds, from the Latin dentis. And then just behind your teeth, at the top of your mouth, there is this bony ridge that you can probably feel with the tip of your tongue if you run your tongue from your teeth and backwards up. This sort of ridge that disappears into the roof of your mouth. That's known as the alveolar ridge. And language sounds made using the alveolar ridge are called alveolar sounds. Then we have, following on from the alveolar ridge, a bony part of the upper part of your mouth known as the hard palate. It's the hard palate because basically there's bone there and it can't actually be moved. And that contrasts with the back part of that, sometimes referred to as the soft palate. Here the bone gives way and all that's left is kind of muscle. And that is, again, used quite a lot for making different types of language sounds. Its technical name is the velum, and therefore sounds which are used making use of the velum are often referred to as velar sounds. One last part of our vocal organs which we use to make sound is further down inside the windpipe, basically behind that hard lump that you've got in the front of your throat, called, we refer to as the Adam's apple. The Adam's apple is actually a piece of bone there that is there to protect this very important organ. And behind that bone we have basically a couple of folds of skin which can be opened or closed, and basically that shuts off access to and from the windpipe. And we can open and close it and do actually quite remarkable things with this piece of equipment that we have. One of its functions is to try to get rid of anything that might have gone into the windpipe that we didn't want to. So basically what we do is we can close it down and then blow suddenly through it, and you get basically a cough. So is the use of the glottis, as we call it. So that's one function, is to sort of like to cough and to stop anything from going in to it. When you're sort of eating, for example, you close your glottis to make sure food doesn't go down that pipe and goes down the other one. The other thing that the glottis is responsible for is vibration. The glottis can vibrate, and that's what you get when you hear sounds like okay, that is basically your glottis vibrating, making those kinds of sounds. We'll talk more about that in a little while. Let's have a look now. We've seen the organs that are used and the kinds of places where they are. Let's have a look at now what you do with those organs to produce sounds. Now, this aspect of producing sound is often referred to as the manner of articulation. The kinds of things that we've been looking at previously are often referred to as the place of articulation. So the lips and the velum and the alveolar, those are places of articulation. So we've got different ways of describing language sounds. There's like a two-way axis here. You've got place and manner of articulation. Manner looks at what you do to produce a sound. The first one we're going to look at are known as plosives. Okay, now what we have here is a sort of a diagram representing the vocal tract, so the kind of the airway, as it were, from your lungs out into the open world through, well, let's just take it to mean through your mouth at the moment. So air flows out of your lungs, out through your mouth, through past your lips and into the world. Okay, so let's take this as a representation of that. Now, what you can do is at some point you can create a closure. You close off that thing. It can be at your lips or with your tongue touching the roof of your mouth or the alveolar ridge or the velum or anywhere. So as long as you stop the flow of air coming out from your lungs. Now what this does is, because your lungs are breathing out, but you've closed the exit for the air, that builds up pressure. Oh yes, I was going to say that precisely because these closures are in your mouth, either with your lips or somewhere like that, they're often referred to as oral stops. So oral stop and plosive are two different terms for the same thing, basically. Okay, so we close off the oral tract, the vocal tract, somewhere, and that causes pressure to build up behind that. And then what happens is you suddenly release the blockage, and that causes air to shoot out from wherever that blockage was. So, for example, p would be a kind of plosive, whereby you've closed the vocal tract at the lips, and then you suddenly release it, and the air flows out suddenly. Okay, another type of producing sound using our vocal organs is known as a fricative. And here what you do is, instead of closing off the vocal tract completely, you partially close it, making a small gap so that air can still escape, but it has to be forced through this small gap. And what happens then is that as air is forced through that gap, we get a kind of hissing sound, basically because what we're doing is causing a friction of the air molecules trying to be forced through a gap which is too small for them. Okay, so you get this hissing sound. So, for example, s is a kind of fricative, whereby we're making a small gap using our tongue on the alveolar ridge, causing the air to be forced through that small gap. We get that hissing sound. Okay, those are fricatives. Now, another kind of sound are known as nasals. Now, we've said that there are two ways for air to escape from the lungs. One is through the oral cavity and one through the nasal cavity. Now, the velum is something which plays an important role in determining where the air is flowing. The velum, as I said, is this soft bit of palate. It's movable, it's a muscle, and you can do all sorts of things with your velum. One thing you can do is to raise it. And basically, you touch the back of your throat using the velum, and by doing so, that blocks off the nasal cavity. Okay, so you can raise and lower your velum up and down. Oops. Okay, now, when it's raised and blocking off the nasal cavity, obviously, when you breathe out, the air flows through your mouth. Now, this is an important part of making a stop, because obviously with a stop, a plosive, what you want to do is to build up pressure behind the stop. And obviously if your velum was lowered, the air would escape through your nose, so you wouldn't build up any pressure at all. The same thing happens, however, if your velum is lowered. That is to say, if you've opened your velum and you create a closure in the oral cavity, what will happen then is that air will escape through the nasal cavity instead. And when you do that, you get what is known as a nasal consonant. Okay, now because this, like plosives, involves a closure of the oral cavity, nasals are also considered to be stop consonants. So there are two types of stops. There are oral stops, basically plosives, and nasal stops, which are not plosives because they allow the air to flow, but not through the mouth. The air flows through your nose, basically, with a nasal stop. Okay, another important aspect of the way we produce sounds, although it isn't actually part of a manner of articulation, it seemed to be something as a sideline, because this is something you can get with both fricatives and with plosives. And this is to do with what we call voicing. Okay, here we've got our picture of a fricative where air is being forced through a partial closure somewhere in the vocal tract. We also, as I've said before, have this a piece of apparatus down inside your windpipe called the glottis. And the glottis, as I said, is responsible for doing all sorts of things, and one thing it does is vibrates and produces what we call voice. Okay, so when you vibrate your glottis, you get this sound, ah. Okay, now you can do that at the same time as producing a fricative. Okay, it requires air to flow through your glottis in order for you to be able to vibrate it. But that's obviously what's happening with a fricative. You are releasing air through this small gap. So what happens is when you vibrate your glottis, you produce this voice, and that accompanies the hissing sound that you've got with the fricative friction hissing sound. Okay, so for example, if s is a fricative without vibrating the glottis, then z is a fricative when you do vibrate your glottis. So we've got the difference between s and z. Okay. Now, you can also do the same sort of thing with plosives, but here there are more options as what you do. A plosive, as we've said, involves a closure of the vocal tract at some point and then a sudden release, allowing the air to flow out of it. Now, if you do that without vibrating your glottis, if you just allow the air to flow out, you get a puff of air coming. Okay, so something like okay, you get this air coming suddenly out from your vocal tract. Those kinds of sounds are known as aspirated plosives. Aspirated plosives are the ones that are accompanied by a puff of air. Okay, and you get that when there is no vibration from your glottis. On the other hand, if you vibrate your glottis at the very same time as you release the closure, so that you get this, the glottis causes vibrations at the same point as you release the blockage, then you get what is known as a voiceless plosive. Okay, they sound like ba or da or ga. Okay, where you're voicing at the same time as releasing the built-up pressure inside your mouth. There's a third thing you can actually do as well, and that is if you start to vibrate your glottis before you release the closure. Now, this is possible because although you need airflow to vibrate your vocal cords, as I said, when you close off the vocal tract, pressure builds up behind, which means basically air is still flowing into the mouth and the oral area, but because air is compressible, you can do that to a certain extent. Now, that means that you're able to vibrate your glottis prior to actually releasing it. And you get sort of sounds like this. Kind of, you can only do that for a certain time because air can't be infinitely compressed, but you can produce a sound without actually releasing anything. Now, if you do that and then release, okay, then you get what is known as a voiced plosive. A voiced plosive is something like b. Hear the voicing before the release, b, and d, and g. Okay, so if you voice before the release, you get a voiced plosive. If you voice at the same time as the release, you get a voiceless plosive. And if you don't voice at the same when you release, you get an aspirated plosive. Now, English has all three of those. Hungarian only makes use of the voiceless and the voiced one. Hungarian doesn't make use of the aspirated plosives at all. We'll see this when we start looking at the different sounds and the sound systems of languages when we look at another area of linguistics known as phonology. Anyway, let's move on. Let's now look at a set of sounds known as liquids and glides, or together these tend to be called the approximants. They are called approximants because basically they're quite difficult to describe what actually is going on with these things, because in many of the cases of these kinds of sounds, your tongue doesn't actually make any contact with anything, and neither does anything else. Whereas with the other kinds of sounds that we've been looking at, your tongue makes contact with either forcing a complete closure or making a partial closure, and then you can fairly easily describe what's going on. Your two lips are coming together and closing off, or your tongue is touching the roof of your mouth, causing a small gap for which air flows through. Those kinds of things we can describe, but these kinds of things, these ones, the liquids and the glides or the approximants, your tongue doesn't really do an awful lot. It does something, but it doesn't do the same kinds of things. It's probably best to try to show you this by comparing a kind of approximant with, say, a fricative. Now, here I've represented the alveolar ridge as seen from the front. So if we've taken John's head and we've cut it down the middle from the front part, so this is just behind the teeth, and it kind of represents this arc thing between your two sets of teeth. Okay. Now, with a fricative that is caused on the alveolar ridge, what we do is we fill that part of the oral cavity with your tongue. But as I say, your tongue is quite an agile muscle, and you can do all sorts of things with it. And one thing you can do with it is to cause this dip in the middle. And that, of course, creates this small gap, and that's the place where the air comes out, and we get this hissing. So s is the sound you get if you put your tongue onto your alveolar ridge, create this small gap, and you get this s sound. Okay. Now, as I said, your tongue is very agile, and that's not the only thing you can do with it. The other thing you could do with it is bunch it up in the middle, okay, and put your tongue on the alveolar ridge. But now note, this creates an air gap on either side of the tongue. This is known as a lateral sound because the air is flowing around the outsides of your tongue rather than down the middle. The fricative that we've just seen is known as a medial sound because the air flows down the middle of your tongue, because that's where you've put that little dimple there. But with this lateral sound, okay, it's not a fricative because the air gap between on both sides of your tongue is too big. It doesn't create any hissing sounds, and clearly it's not a plosive either because you're not blocking off the oral cavity. So you get this kind of sound that sounds like okay. It's not anything like a fricative or a plosive. In fact, if anything, it sounds more like a vowel. And these kinds of sounds are sometimes referred to as semivowels. So the approximants and semivowels, again, it's the same kind of referring to the same kinds of sounds. Now, there are two different types of approximants. There are things that we call liquids and things that we call glides. Now, the liquids are, well, just like we've just seen when we were talking about the L sound, the liquids involve a contact with some part of your vocal apparatus. This sound, the tongue actually makes contact with the alveolar ridge, even though the airflow actually isn't affected because the gap either side of the tongue is big enough to allow the air to flow fairly freely. Now that's a lateral one because the air flows around the outside. There is also an approximant, a liquid, where instead of having the tongue bunched up in the middle, you bunch the tongue up on the outside part. So this is a medial one. But note, this is quite different from the fricatives that we've just seen because the dip
in the middle of the tongue is quite big to allow the air to flow straight through. This one is the sound sound. Now there's a little bit more to be said about that sound, but essentially it's exactly the opposite of a sound. You bunch your tongue up on either side, touching the alveolar ridge at the sides there, and lower the middle part and allow the air to flow fairly freely. Now, after the liquids, we also have glides. Now, the glides are quite different from the liquids in terms of the fact that there's actually no contact made with any part of your apparatus. So we still get a very free-flowing air movement, but what the glides involve is a movement of something or other, and that's what produces this sound. Let's take, for example, the fact that with one, what you do is you move your tongue up towards the palate of the mouth there. So this isn't actually produced on the alveolar ridge at all. It's not produced on the palate either, because your tongue doesn't actually make contact with it. Instead, what you do is you move the tongue up towards the palate and then bring it back down again. And this is what you get with a sound like y. Okay, so note that that is produced with a movement of the tongue. You couldn't pronounce y without actually moving your tongue. A similar thing happens, but not with the tongue at all, but with your lips. Now, we know that your lips can be used in making sounds like p and b, as well as with f and v. But those are fricatives and plosives. The approximant, again, doesn't actually close off anything, doesn't really block the flow of air at all. But what you do with this one is you purse your lips and then bring them apart again. And what you get when you do that is a w sound. W. Okay, again, it's produced by the movement of the lips, and you couldn't get the sound without moving your lips. Those ones then, the more dynamic of the approximants are called the glides, whereas the ones where you actually make contact with some part of your apparatus, typically the alveolar ridge, those are the liquids.
Okay, so that's as much of that I want to introduce you to here. We've looked at two aspects of the production of consonant sounds. We've looked at the place of articulation and the manner of articulation. With the place of articulation, we've got the use of the lips, labial sounds, sometimes referred to as bilabial sounds because often it's two lips that are used. So, for example, with m and p and w sounds, we're using both lips. So those are called bilabial sounds. Then we've got the teeth. Actually, English and Hungarian don't make use much of the teeth to produce sounds, so there are some in English. So, for example, th and the make use of the tongue actually coming between your teeth, and so often those are referred to as interdental sounds. Then we also have sounds where you use both the lips and the teeth together. Typically it's your bottom lip and your top teeth to produce what is known as a labiodental sound. So it sounds like th and v are labiodentals. Alveolar sounds, obviously, those are the ones that we use the alveolar ridge for, and there's actually quite an awful lot of sounds which we make use of the alveolar ridge for, s being one, t and d being another, r being one, as we've already seen, n, a nasal, is also one. So there's actually quite a lot of sounds made at the alveolar. Just behind the alveolar, there is this area before it turns into the palate, where we can also make sounds which are quite different from the alveolar ones. For example, consider sh as opposed to s. Okay, sh means it involves moving your tongue slightly back from the alveolar ridge, where s is actually produced. Then we have the velar sounds produced on the velum. Okay, this is further back in your mouth. Sounds like g and k are made at that point. And then you also have glottal sounds, sounds which make use of the glottis. Now, we've already said glottis is used for vibrating, but you can also produce other sounds. For example, that is a fricative caused by partially closing your glottis without vibrating it, and so you get the hissy sound. We also get a plosive in some languages. Hungarian doesn't make use of it, but certain dialects of English do, and even you get it in standard, where you basically close the glottis and then suddenly open it again, producing basically a cough. Okay, and in language that sounds like for example, in the pronunciation of Scotland, okay, to emphasize it. It's not tended to pronounce Scotland, it's Scotland, okay? And as I said, certain other dialects or accents of English make use of this even more. In London, for example, what is known as the Cockney accent makes use of these glottal stops. For example, better and butter kind of pronunciations. Okay, as to the manner of articulation, we've seen there are stops where we close off the oral cavity. Now, if that's all we use, we stop the oral cavity but don't allow the air to escape through the nose, then we get a plosive. That's an oral stop. Or if we do lower the velum and allow the air to go through the nasal cavity, then we get a nasal stop. Then we've got the fricatives, where we cause a partial blockage and blow through that to create hissing sounds. So s, f, are kind of different types of fricatives. And then finally we've got these approximants, where you do something with your tongue, but you don't actually make any stops or any kind of partial gaps for air to travel through. These are, as I said, more like vowel type qualities. They're halfway between a consonant and a vowel, sometimes called a semi-vowel, the approximants. Okay. For example, we've got the liquids, l, and the glides like r, y, and w, okay, which involve a movement of the tongue or the lips. Then we've also talked about voicing. That actually isn't part of manner of articulation or place of articulation. Basically, you can voice or not voice, or you can aspirate certain combinations of places and manners of articulation to get different sounds. Okay. That's everything, and I will see you in class where we will be looking at some exercises trying to get you to put this knowledge into use. See you then. Bye-bye.